It is my great pleasure to introduce World Federation Neurology YouTube audience to Professor Anthony Land, fondly known as Tony Land. Professor Tony Land is probably the most cited scientist that Canada had seen. I'm not going to go through his CV, otherwise we would not finish this interview. His citation index over 100,000 and his H index is very close to the sky. Tony, we all know that you are a hardworking, brilliant, approachable, pleasant neuroscientist. But my first question to you, as you are well aware, for the first time in history, World Federation Neurology and Movement Disorder Society joining forces together to talk about a different pandemic in the middle of the pandemic that both of us are living in. The pandemic that they're going to concentrate on is Parkinson's disease, which is hidden because not many people know that it is indeed a pandemic. These two organizations are dedicating 2020 World Brain Day campaign, which would go beyond one day throughout the year with a virtual press brief at MDS Virtual Congress or Conference. How excited are you as a passionate neuroscientist and an advocate for Parkinson's disease and brain health in general to see a World Brain Day dedicated to Parkinson's disease in collaboration with two massive, powerful organizations?
As you point out, this is very, very exciting and highly due recognition, not only that brain diseases are critical and drawing people's attention to the importance of brain diseases, but particularly Parkinson's disease, the second commonest neurodegenerative disease. Very, very large number of people across the world affected by this disorder. And I think it is very under-recognized, despite the fact that important people have had Parkinson's disease, for example, the Pope some time ago. I think there still is this concept that slowing down and stooping and developing slowness is a normal feature of aging. And you have to expect this as people get older, and there's really very little to do for it. I think it really is very important for the general population to understand this is a neurological disease that affects a very large proportion of the population, causing tremendous suffering and disability. And I'm very excited to know that these two important organizations are coming together to highlight this in the way that they are.
Thank you, Tony. Let's hope that the whole world, not only Canada, Australia, Europe, and USA, embrace this and raise awareness, because it is critically important. I was talking to one of the colleagues in India today on a similar interview. He made a point that not like in Australia or developed world, we have to work hard on awareness. I quickly corrected him. Even in Melbourne, despite the advances in medicine, I still see patients who do not get the diagnosis for years with Parkinson's disease. And raising awareness is necessary wherever we are. There's still a lot of work to do. I'm going to change this direction a little bit. Everybody know that you are a giant in movement disorders world, and everybody know the contribution that you have done to the humanity. Not many people know other things that they can't find out about you by Googling. I'm going to straight head into that. Tony, tell me, as a young kid at high school or primary school, what motivated you to pursue medicine? Why medicine? Why not something else?
Well, I've told this story before. I really came to medicine by accident, by happenstance. In high school, as you say, you're planning and thinking that you have certain capabilities and interests, and my capabilities, at least at the time, I thought were related to mathematics. In grade 13, which high school was 5 years in Canada at the time, in the final year, we had two types of mathematics. I can't even remember now which types they were. One was geometry and another was an alternative. And I had 100% in one and 99% in the other in the final year, the final examinations. So it was logical for me to say, well, I'm going to be a mathematician. Mm-hmm. I went to the University of Toronto. Uh, at that time, there were multiple math courses in the first year of the university. Math 140 was the highest and most difficult. I hedged my bets a little bit and did Math 139, so just one below, but it wasn't Math 101 or 120 or anything below that. So I did the second most difficult mathematics. And I very quickly realized that people that excelled at that level had a brain that was wired very differently than mine. These were natural mathematic experts that got it very, it was common sense to them, very natural, whereas I struggled a lot with the concepts. I got through, but I realized this was not my forte. So in first year university, in addition to mathematics, I did some physics and chemistry. Did mainly the sciences, although I did some arts as well. And coming out of first year, I said, well, what am I going to do? I can't do mathematics. What are my alternatives? What are my options? And I realized I had enough science by completing a second year to add to this with a couple more courses that I could do medicine. So really, I said, okay, I can't do math. What else am I interested in? And medicine was just one option that I thought I'd give it a go. I have no physicians in my family. I had no mentors that led me to be interested in medicine. It was really just an alternative that I thought I'd explore. After that, I obviously became quite addicted to the idea and very enthusiastic and went full force. But to begin with, it really was an accident.
I mean, I can come with an anecdote. I remember, you probably know that I grew up in rural Sri Lanka, and I had no idea that after HSC you could get into medicine in that school at that time at least. Everybody was raising hand to do mathematics or biology. I was okay with mathematics, but I didn't really enjoy it, and I had no idea by doing biology you could get into medicine. When others were raising hand to do biology, I was hedging my bet where to go, and then I put my hands up, not knowing where I would end up. Here we are both of us today talking about movement disorders. So that's the
when I finally got into medicine, most of my friends had experience with medicine in their family. So their father was a doctor, their mother was a doctor, aunts and uncles and all the rest. So I was sort of a little bit different than most of the friends I had in that they had their families encouraging them to go into medicine. So it took a little while to connect.
How were there interview process at that time, or just the merit entry to the medical school?
Both interviews and exams. So I guess I failed the interviews in terms of my enthusiasm for medicine. Although I guess I must have impressed somebody that I think now getting into medical school is so much more difficult. It's really quite amazing. I always look back at my career and say, if I had to fulfill the criteria for whatever level my junior people are challenged with now, I doubt whether I would have made it. Medical school, I got in after 2 years of university. Now people need PhDs and doctorates to get into medical school, and the same with getting into neurology. So it's a different challenge.
So any memorable experiences in medical school that you can share in this open forum?
In medical school, well, I guess again it shows how you evolve and change. I was really forced to concentrate and focus and study, and at that time, medicine really was memorization. Now we really concentrate on the lifelong learning process. You have a problem-based learning where you're challenged to try to put together a problem and learn many aspects, the anatomy, the physiology, the biochemistry from a specific case. Whereas at the time, in my training, it really was you were given the anatomy and you had to memorize all the anatomy, and then you had the histology and you memorized. So it really was by rote, really the wrong way to learn. And in doing that, you really realized how much memorization you had to do. And in my third year of medical school, I did that very well. I concentrated and spent all my time memorizing. and did well. I think at University of Toronto in third year I stood first. But again, it was not really learning the way we think is important to learn now. So I can be critical of my own experiences and also my own attitude, because having done so well in third year, I was approached by the dean of the medical school asking me whether I would take some students who were struggling under my wing and help them along. And I saw that as a threat to my ability to succeed. Right. And in fact, I declined. Right. And in the same way, subsequently in my neurology training, early in my neurology training, I was doing very well, but again, the same reason. And I was approached to be involved in some research, and I declined because I saw that as sort of distracting me from what my preconceived notion was that would allow me to succeed. I now see, and it's kind of interesting, in my early career, I declined to be involved in research. Whereas now, I see research as the whole reason for doing what we do. So it's interesting how I've really had to mature and evolve and see the need to change the way we learn and to change the way we direct our fields.
So you were very focused and driven at that time. At what point, Tony, did you turn towards brain and movement disorders? Was that also accidental, or were there mentors, or were there specific examples that drew you to those two fields, given that they were pretty primitive at that stage? There was hardly any therapeutics, I believe.
Well, I think when I finally decided on internal medicine as opposed to surgery, I really loved the clinical examination. I loved to be able to leave the bedside really having a very good understanding of what the problem was. So it was the history and the physical exam. And at the time, this was pre all of the detailed technological advances in cardiology. Mm-hmm. So cardiology very much was an examination subspecialty. So being able to use auscultation, being able to look at the jugular waves, not just the height of the jugular pressure, but the actual waves, being able to perceive differences in the pulses. So the water hammer pulse of somebody with aortic insufficiency, for example. And at the time, Toronto had a cardiologist mentor who worked in Buffalo, New York, very close to Toronto, and he would come up and teach the students. His name was Jules Constant. I always remember this, and he wrote a book called Bedside Cardiology. And I knew that book, like I said, I read it and memorized it by rote. I really loved the ability to apply these techniques and this knowledge at the bedside. And so I really was going to become a cardiologist. This was just as M-mode electrocardiology was just coming in. So before two-dimensional electrocardiology, or three-dimensional, I should say. So M-mode was beginning to teach you a little bit that you could use a technological advance, but really it was very immature. And so I did cardiology. I did cardiac embryology between first and second year medical school. I did a stint in the medical school for a summer job. And then between second and third year medicine, I did a summer job in pediatric cardiology. I was working in transposition of the great vessels and tetralogy of Fallot. And so I was going to become a cardiologist. There was no question in my mind. I planned that. I actually discussed my future with cardiologists and was proposed a position in the cardiology program. And then one weekend, as I was a second-year medical student or second-year resident, I did my rotation in neurology. And on one weekend, working with a brilliant teacher too, then that was very helpful, a mentor, I experienced neurology in its tremendous variety. Whereas cardiology, the exam was great, the patients only complained of what? Chest pain, shortness of breath, fainting, palpitations, swelling of ankles. There weren't that many more interesting complaints that cardiac patients had. But this one weekend, I had neurology patients with every different complaint you could imagine, with lesions all over the nervous system. And I must admit, I was on call this one weekend, and I was high as a kite the whole weekend, excited by the challenges that the history and the physical examination was presenting me. And it was encouraged by working with this mentor. But after the weekend, I had to separate the man from the specialty, which I fortunately successfully did, and realized neurology was much more exciting and interesting. And you could be a detective in neurology. You could really put together the story that the patient presented you, which, as you know, is very critical. It's at least half the answer, if not more in many cases. And then the neurologic examination, a good neurologic exam with a good knowledge of neuroanatomy, really helping you put it all together. So that's what made me very excited by neurology. And then movement disorders, the phenomenology, subsequently working with this same mentor. His name was Joe Murata. He worked at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. Wonderful man, wonderful teacher, enthusiastic. Everybody loved to learn at his feet. And I always remember he brought a patient into the teaching sessions, patient with Parkinson's disease with really horrible motor fluctuations. And this patient would go without his levodopa before coming in, and we would see him immobile, barely able to move, didn't have much of a tremor, amazingly bradykinetic. And at the beginning of the interview, he would take his levodopa, and we would see him switch on like a light switch and become mobile and somewhat dyskinetic and able to do everything that he couldn't do when he was off. And this was just such an amazing experience. And in fact, that was one of the reasons that I became a movement disorder specialist. That and some experience reading a paper by David Marsden and Dan Tarsi, for interesting, Dan from Boston. They wrote a paper on drug-induced movement disorders, from acute dystonic reactions through to akathisia and tardive dyskinesia. And that whole spectrum of movement disorders really turned me on as well.
Tony, that was a brilliant story. I'm assuming that this was Index Medicus days, no internet journals, no email. So you would have been reading books from the library. So you would have read these things on printed books. How did you keep the enthusiasm going despite that? I'm still amazed with the speed that all these authors were producing papers in pre-internet, pre-EndNote, pre-Mendeley era. These days, it is so much to write these things with all the software and all kind of libraries at your fingertips.
Yeah, obviously, technology has really advanced knowledge tremendously. I think there's a negative side to it as well. It has made people far less critical because there's just so much to read. And in fact, there's so many journals now that it's really easy eventually to get things published without a very critical review. And a lot of the open access journals, I think everybody listening to this knows that they probably get 100 emails a day asking them to submit papers to journals they've never heard of. I get requests to write papers for this morning for a gynecology journal and a surgical journal. And unfortunately, with these requests, there are a lot of manuscripts that go out that people like the site, or if you're looking for something, they come up with these papers in their searches. And unfortunately, they are often less critical than they should be of the descriptions or of the material that's in these papers. So there's huge advantage, huge progress that's been made with this technology and advancing the science. But also, I think we're often a little less critical, and there's a lot of garbage in the literature as well. But finding things, when we were looking at PubMed and looking at the hard copies of various different ways of searching the literature, was a big challenge.
You do know that these days, I agree with both points. I was asked to do a review. In fact, some journals ask you to become members of editorial board in gynecology and surgical specialties where you have got absolutely nothing to do. So they were just randomly picking your name, not on the basis of your writing or anything. The two comments, I remember accessing Sir William Osler's textbook in a Canadian library through internet and then sharing it with my students recently, pulling some of the points because some of those sayings are still gold. And I also remember, as I was writing an invited review to one of the WFN journals looking at COVID-19 and stroke, I won't name, one of the most prestigious journals published 4 or 5 papers. The authors who were well respected cited the paper, which was actually non-existing. I couldn't believe that how 5 authors managed to quote a non-existing paper in a very prestigious journal, and all 5 got published, I guess, in a hurry with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we just need to be critical, basically.
Yeah, so this is an interesting time that shows you both the benefits and the problems with our system. So this need to see information come out, to drive our knowledge and to keep people up to date with what can complicate or can be a manifestation of this new disease. So obviously you see the critical importance of distribution of this knowledge, but also the excessive drive to publish and to take advantage of the ability to publish quickly and often without enough careful thought. You see both sides of a problem, so an advantage and a disadvantage. And so I think we have to be very wary of the problems, very critical of the speed of publication, but also taking advantage of it. So I think as long as we go into it with our eyes wide open, understanding the disadvantages and the problems, and can be critical, as you did, in reviewing the accuracy, that's the most important thing.
And also we should remind our youngsters, Tony, some of the old material are pure gold. Recently, as of, I think actually yesterday, I told my resident that when we were eliciting basic things like reflex, go back to some of the writing by Wartenberg on reflex, and then one of the great Australians whom we lost last year, late Jim Lance, he did a Wartenberg lecture on reflexes, and I find some of those original writings still crystal clear, explaining physiology, much more so than some of the current most up-to-date reviews in all those open access journals. Same go ahead with Marsden's original description on dystonia. I can't remember the exact year, 1982 or 86. There was one handbook, I think that's the only copy available in Australia. I seems to be the only person who is borrowing it all the time. And I still love that description, which analyze things much better than some of the recent writings. So coming back to you, Tony, your days with David Marsden, you could correct me wrong. I'm assuming that when you were writing to him to go and do a fellowship with him, he was sort of a non-existing entity. So you would have taken a risk to go to him, although the word probably would have gone out that he was a clever man. He probably wouldn't have had a whole lot of publications. He probably wouldn't have had a big name at that time. Did you ever feel that you were taking a risk to go to a sort of a unknown man in Queen Square at that time?
Well, he certainly didn't have the reputation that he subsequently developed, but he was beginning to develop that. And at the time, there weren't that many centers that specialized in the field of movement disorders. So trained in Canada, one of the long-standing tradition of my mentors was to go to Queen Square, go to England. At the time, David Marsden was not at Queen Square, though. He was the youngest professor in the United Kingdom, and he had taken a position at King's College and the Institute of Psychiatry, which was south of the river, whereas, as most people know, Queen Square is north of the river.
I've been to that place. I have been to that place. It's not a big place, isn't it?
No. So there was I took a bit of a chance in doing that because it wasn't a mecca of neurology the way Queen Square was, and wasn't a center that was known, for example, in North America. North America would have been easier to go. The two leading movement disorder people at the time in North America, one was in Chicago, Harold Klawans. I had heard Harold lecture, and he was a very boisterous, brash, somewhat difficult man. He was known to be very critical of people during his lectures. Actually, I always remember one of the problems at the time was you could have slides that were too thick for the carousels, and they'd get stuck in the slide machine, and it would always delay. It was like your computer has crashed, your slides have crashed here, and it would always slow the lecture down. And he would always end up criticizing the projectionist rather than recognize that it was his own fault because he was putting too large slides in. Whereas in the same series, for example, the American Academy of Neurology, Stan Fawn, who was the other big name in North America, in New York, was very humble and apologetic. So it would happen to Stan, and he'd say, "I'm sorry, it's my fault, let's just fix it." Whereas Harold Klawans would claim it was the responsibility of the technician. So I didn't want to go to work with this brash guy from Chicago, and I didn't particularly want to work in New York. I didn't have a desire to work in New York as much as I liked Stan's lectures. So then the third man was David Marsden. And the tradition, as I say, for Canadians to go to the United Kingdom, I thought it would be closer to working in Canada than going to the United States. It turned out it wasn't. It was much different than Canada.
You were married at that time with children, or you were single?
I was married with 2 young children, so I had a very tolerant wife who was willing to pick up stakes and move to the United Kingdom for a couple of years. There were hard. I'm sorry?
Was she in medicine too?
No, she was in social sciences, and she actually didn't work while we were in England. So again, she did a lot for my career in supporting me and allowing me to do that. That wouldn't have been possible without her support.
Were you financially comfortable in UK when you visited Marsden for the first time?
Well, it was more of a shock than I had expected moving to England. We had expected everything to be very, very similar, and it really is a very different culture than Canada. So it took a little while to get used to. David was very kind and supportive when I first went to meet with him. I was on a Canadian Medical Research College, Medical Research Council fellowship, so David wasn't paying me, and he was getting a free fellow. So he was quite happy to have me. Unlike many of our fellowship programs now, he didn't have very many people working with him at the time. Fortunately for me, the people he worked with were absolutely brilliant and wonderful. So I joined Neil Quinn and Jose Obeso, who subsequently became brothers and closest friends, and really helped me settle in well, taught me and supervised me as I started my fellowship. So that was wonderful.
So Philip Thompson was not in the scene at that point of time? He came
No,
later.
Philip came quite a bit later, yeah.
So I want to spend a bit more time during your early days. Tell me about your first day. So your first meeting with David Marsden for the first time.
Well, I showed up, I was by that point pretty confident and brash. And I left Toronto having generally called most of my supervisors by their first name. So I had a familiarity breeds respect concept rather than anything else. And I really liked a relationship with my teachers where they allowed me to be familiar with them. I always remember when I first started neurology, 2 of the senior neurologists, one was a Canadian, John Edmeades, another was a Brit working in the same hospital by the name of John Norris, who unfortunately just died recently. And I proposed to John Edmeades, who was the head of neurology, that I call him John, and he looked at me, said, "Yeah, okay, that's fine, that's great." And then I went to Dr. John Norris, and I said, do you mind if I call you John? And Dr. Norris said, no, I think Professor Norris would be much better. Right. And so I realized I couldn't do the same with everybody. But after a couple of years of neurology, I went to England, and first day with David Marsden, I said, "What do I call you?" And he was used to everybody calling him Prof, and I guess that's the tradition from the British training. But he looked at me and he said, "Well, my friends call me David." And I said, "Well, do you mind if I call you David?" And he, again, a couple seconds by, and he said, "Yeah, well, I guess that's okay." And it was very peculiar because everybody, all his peers and colleagues, still called him Professor or Prof. And here this brash Canadian starts to call him David the first day. They really looked at me like I was crazy, but I got away with it, and it did make for a nice relationship. And then I joined the group. We had Parkinson's clinics at King's College were Wednesday afternoons, and David Parks was a wonderful teacher and a bit of a crazy Brit who taught us and ran the Parkinson's clinic, whereas David Marsden would just show up periodically, and he would explore his ideas by talking to patients. So he would disappear with a patient in a clinic office just to talk and teach himself about the disease and help his concepts evolve. So we really didn't have a lot of experience with David Marsden and Parkinson's disease in our Parkinson's clinic. It was more the teaching that we had at the Institute of Psychiatry at the Maudsley Hospital on Friday mornings, where we had the clinic in movement disorders, where David would see patients with us and we would teach and learn. And so that was our Friday experience with David was just phenomenal. That's where we really recognized his brilliance and his mentorship and his teaching.
Certainly, he was a remarkable man when you look back the history. I think you did a beautiful interview which is available in NBS library for people who are interested in early days. So how many years did you spend in King's and London, for that matter?
It was a 2 years fellowship. Began doing a bit of clinical, and then in my extra time, I started in the lab. And at the time, and one of the strengths of David Marsden's group was that David had expertise in not only clinical, where he was absolutely brilliant, but electrophysiology, as everybody knows, and pharmacology. So he had an electrophysiology group headed by, at the time, John Rothwell was starting to work with him and really building a tremendous expertise and career with several other wonderful trainees and electrophysiologists. And Jose Obeso was doing electrophysiology with him at the same time. And then in pharmacology, Peter Jenner ran the pharmacology program. And at the time, they were especially interested in neuroleptics and the effect of neuroleptics. And that's why David had written that review paper on drug-induced movement disorders. And so I started to work in pharmacology with Jenner, doing work in rat models. But fairly quickly, I got busy in the clinic, and I think I wish that I had stayed doing more animal research as well as clinical research. So I lost that ability. And very quickly, my time was eaten up doing clinical research. So I finished 2 years mainly doing that, drug trials, work describing unusual movement disorders, and then came back to Canada.
So by this time, still Movement Disorder Society was not born. Am I correct?
I'm sorry?
By this time, Movement Disorder Society was not born.
No. David and Stan Fawn were doing the American Academy of Neurology Unusual Movement Disorders course. So they had already developed this idea of videotapes and describing and documenting interesting phenomenology. And that really was revolutionary because people really described or discussed movement disorders, but didn't have accurate phenomenological documentation. 8mm movies were available, but they weren't widely used and certainly not discussed in academic sessions. And so David and Stan started to work with videotapes and using these in academic sessions at the American Academy and then at other meetings. It wasn't until the mid-'80s, I guess, that the Movement Disorder Society was born, I guess mid to late 80s. And many people know the story that a group of neurologists interested in this, Stan Fawn, David Marsden, Andrew Lees, Eduardo Tolosa, Joe Jankovic, not sure whether I've named them all, met in Hamburg at the World Congress of Neurology, the World Federation of Neurology. And actually, Neil Quinn and I were waiting in the bar for this group to finish. And so we knew something was going on. And so they came down to the bar, and we were the first to hear the announcement of the birth of the Movement Disorder Society. And the Movement Disorder Society was built to develop a journal with a video supplement. So taking advantage of what David and Stan had developed and bring it to a journal. So it was the first journal to have a videotape supplement.
In fact, I would strongly encourage viewers with MD's membership to drop in to read the first journal. It's a beautiful read. They wrote a flamboyant editorial which was very ambitious, and they certainly lived up to their prediction. With Joe Jankovic wrote a nice review on tics, I believe 10 or 12 pages. So when you come back to Canada, Tony, how easy were you to set up an academic center and kept flourishing, doing fabulous clinical service as well as research work? And many fellows who spent time with you told me multiple times at various meetings your amazing video library and how accessible they are for them wherever they are, even today.
Well, I was very fortunate in that my division of neurology and Department of Medicine in Canada, in most centers, neurology is a division of medicine, not a separate department, unlike the United States. I'm not sure what it is in Australia for the most part, but we're a division of medicine. And I was very fortunate in that my leaders, my bosses, were very supportive of me developing a subspecialty. There was no one in Toronto at the time that was specialty trained. There were a couple of people who had an interest in Parkinson's disease and movement disorders, but didn't do it very well, and certainly hadn't been trained in the phenomenology and the intricacies, the pharmacology, etc. So I began by myself a small clinic where I would just see movement disorders. It became clear to me fairly soon that Parkinson's was going to dominate and I needed some help. So I actually got a couple of colleagues to work part-time in the clinic who developed an interest in movement disorders, but again, they weren't trained. My hospital was very supportive in giving me funds for a nurse. And that really did help immensely to have a nurse that was specialty trained by me and dedicated to Parkinson's and movement disorders. And that came before I ever had a fellow. And that really helped a great deal in managing patients and handling the patients from a distance, telephone calls and things like that. And then a great guy from Canada contacted me and asked me whether I'd train him as a fellow. A guy by the name of David Riley was my first fellow. He subsequently went to work in Cleveland after his fellowship. And David, unlike what I had done in looking for places that had an established fellowship program, David had attended the American Academy of Neurology and was starting to read the literature. And he saw this guy working by himself, but establishing himself, making comments at meetings and getting a bit of a reputation. And what David said to himself is, I want to work with somebody who's going to pay attention to me, who's going to really concentrate on me as his sole fellow, rather than having to spread his interests around a large number of people. And that was kind of neat. And so I happened to be able to get a little bit of funding through a drug study and hired David as my first fellow. And that was wonderful. That really taught me the fantastic interchange between a mentor and a trainee who is a sponge, who is soaking up the field, who's doing this like I did in my training, who just wanted to learn about a subspecialty. And that really turned me on to training people, turned me on to the importance of fellowship training and research. And we were starting to do lots of videotapes. And as you say, subsequently, I've videotaped thousands and thousands of patients. We digitized all our videotapes and have saved them in a library. And now our library at the Toronto Western Hospital, I bet is as good as any for showing people really any kind of movement disorder you can imagine.
I believe so. I believe your ex-fellows are contacting you for some of the video clips even today from various places in the world, as I hear from some of them.
Well, what we did, many people don't know, what we did when we were digitizing from videotape to digital for computer use, I was, I can't remember whether I was the president of the Movement Disorder Society by then. It may have been one of my earlier positions in leadership at the society, but we were also digitalizing all of the CD-ROMs for the Movement Disorders Journal, all the videos, and then subsequently the CDs. We put them all together for my library for teaching the fellows and residents. And so I offered the Movement Disorder Society all of these digitized videos to put on their website. So all of the old journal videotapes that were digitized, we did in my unit and basically gave to the society. So that was the start of the society's videotape collection.
Yes, which I believe is probably one of the best educational collection, any educational website, anything to do with neurology. Tony, I know you spent a significant amount of time with me already. But I still like to know your Movement Disorder Society days up to the leadership, and what are you mostly proud of looking back?
Well, I've been very fortunate to grow up in the Movement Disorder Society. I think that the society, the now International Parkinson and Movement Disorder Society, has been one of the most, if not the most influential factor in the development of our field. And it certainly has molded me and influenced me. As I say, I was there at the beginning. I wasn't one of the originators, but I certainly started with the society. I was on the first editorial board of the journal. Stan Fawn and David Marsden nurtured and mentored me as a junior faculty. I then became the editor of the journal with Andrew Lees. And so one of my most strongest memories and features that have influenced me has been my work as the editor of the Movement Disorders Journal. But I've also served in the leadership position. I was a treasurer, a secretary, a president-elect, and a president, a past president. I'm probably one of the, I may be the only person who has held every leadership position in the society. I don't know of anybody else that was secretary, treasurer, and president. And I also, I think, served as president longest because we were turning over the presidency in January. And then it was decided to turn over the presidency at the time of the Congress, which was moved to June. Mm-hmm. And so when I was president, I had a choice, and my group, my leadership group, had a choice of either an 18-month leadership, which seemed far too short, or a 2.5-year stint. And so I was president for 2.5 years, whereas I think all of the other presidents have been president for 2 years. So I can be proud of being president probably longer than most as well. Whether people liked it or not, I don't know. So my work as president makes me very proud, and one of the things that I did during that time is establish the Pan American section. And that is something I'm very, very proud of, because I've seen that flourish along with all of the other sections to really make our society a unique international organization that really has allowed people at every stage in their career to thrive. I'm very proud of the way our society nurtures young people, really gives them a place to grow, recognizes their strengths and their contributions. And I think that all of the leaders before me and subsequently to me have all recognized the need to do that. So I'm very proud of what the society has done and my contributions to it.
At the MDS Congresses, one of the most entertaining thing for me personally is the so-called Video Olympics that we had to change name later on. You and Dr. Sethi seems to have whole heaps of fun, and the whole audience. I think I would do an injustice if I don't ask a question on this. I'm sure you thoroughly enjoy this too.
Yeah, so you've now mentioned another thing that I'm very, very proud of, that was born from an experience that I had as a visiting professor in Paris, France. One evening, Eva Gide and I were asked to chair a session where great cases from all over France were brought together to compete with one another, and there were awards for the best case. And having experienced that wonderful evening, I realized that we could do this on an international scope. And I was the president of the society at the time, and so I proposed that we have a very similar session where people were invited from all over the world to submit their best cases, and we would demonstrate them in a session that now has become very well known and widely attended and appreciated. We called it the Video Olympics to begin with. And I invited Kapil Sethi to join me co-hosting the session. And it ran as the Video Olympics.
The perfect match.
Well, I love the man. He's a close friend and just wonderful character. And I think we play off each other very well. We have different strengths, and it's a wonderful experience to work with him. Although I am angry at him because, as you mentioned, we were called the Video Olympics, and after 2 or 3 years of that, he, without telling me or asking me, he asked the Society's Secretariat to write to the Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, to allow us to formally use the term Olympics, Video Olympics. And I mean, the Olympic Committee had no idea we were doing this, didn't care, but now that you asked them formally, we received a cease and desist letter from the International Olympics Committee saying, not only can you not use the name Olympics, the term Olympics, anything to do with the Olympic logo with the rings, you can't use any of that. And so the Movement Disorder Society spoke to their lawyers. We were no longer allowed to do anything like that. The year that we got this, I made a logo, a fun logo, where I pretended someone with essential tremor drew the Olympic rings. So all of the rings had this tremulous circle around them. So that was my attempt at poking fun at the Olympic Committee.
Right.
We then changed the name to Video Games, but right in the middle of the event, I realized that we shouldn't be using the term games because these are patients that suffer a great deal from their experiences. So I really didn't think that was appropriate. So very quickly, the next year, we called it the Video Challenge, as challenging cases to us and cases that we hopefully learn from and hopefully then teach ourselves how to treat patients better, learn and diagnose and treat our patients better. So as we're on that topic for your listeners and viewers, obviously we're in a strange time. The Movement Disorder Society is challenged by not having the ability to have their normal meeting. We're not going to be able to have 2,000 or 3,000 people in an audience live cheering us on and enjoying our interchange. As you know, the Movement Disorders Congress is a virtual Congress this year. And I'll announce now to your viewership how we're going to do this. We're going to do it a different way, and I hope it will be entertaining and educational. Once again, we've invited people to submit cases from all over the world. We have selected those cases now, so we've already chosen the cases as of a couple of weeks ago. We have, instead of a small group of experts, we've invited a large group of outstanding experts, many of whom, pretty well all of them, have excelled in previous video challenges or video Olympic sessions. These people have all shown their capability of discussing the phenomenology and really putting together tough cases. So at this time, what we're going to do is we're going to give the case, a shortened version of the case, and the video only to an individual expert in advance of the presentation. So they're going to come to the presentation with a discussion, having seen the video and having seen the description of the case with the history, and nothing more than that. That expert will be challenged to educate the audience. How do they approach the phenomenology? How do they look at the case and the history? How do they put it together? And give the audience the phenomenological discussion, a differential diagnosis discussion, and then a short preferential diagnosis. As usual, the answer is not the important thing. It's really, how did they get close to that answer? How did they put the case together? We will then reveal to the audience the correct diagnosis. We expect sometimes the expert will get the answer. Often they won't get the answer. They're often very tough cases, but we've got bright people and they'll often get the answer too. And then we've given the whole case to another expert who will summarize the unique aspects of the case and give us a very brief educational description of what's unique, what's different, what are the take-home messages that these cases present. So we're going to have about 12 cases that are presented in this fashion, with a first discussant and a second discussant. And then before the meeting, we're also going to give you some teasers. We're going to distribute short cases through social media or on the Movement Disorder Society website for people to see interesting cases that didn't quite make the final cut, or that were just short enough that we didn't think would have enough to discuss on a large or long case kind of session. So that's the plan. So you're going to start seeing, your audience is going to start seeing teasers, some interesting cases coming out to get you interested and enthusiastic about the final presentation that'll come out in September.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Tony, and for the audience, you should get this opportunity. At least one good thing that I see out of this pandemic is, Tony, we have made education equally accessible right across the world. I told you that I come from rural Sri Lanka originally. Sri Lanka is a developing world country. They have more smartphones than the population that they have. So what I'm trying to say is, globally, access to information is easy enough now. And MDS Virtual Congress is free to participants. So you could be having $10 worth earning for the week, but you can still get to world-best the experts who spend their life on these things, analyzing these cases, basically a masterclass of clinical reasoning for any specialty in medicine for that matter. Obviously, neurology is the queen of internal medicine. And I would strongly encourage you to log in and join in and enjoy. I really enjoy these the video Olympics, as I would like to call them.
Well, we're going to call them Video Challenge again. I think you're right. This is very exciting. Video Challenge has been viewed by one of the largest audiences that the Movement Disorder Society Congress has, but now we have the opportunity to reach an even larger audience. So hopefully people will enjoy it and learn. We're going to record the presentations in advance. Next month, we're going to spend quite a bit of time preparing each case, and we hope that the Sethi Lang dynamic will be retained. We're going to have a Zoom kind of pre-recording where we'll go back and forth, and so hopefully it'll be both educational and enjoyable.
It will be. It will be. I can warn you, Tony, the European Academy of Neurology meeting was attended over 40,000 people.
Oh my goodness.
Because they offered it free. Knowing how popular MDS Congress is, my prediction is we would have a break of that record. So be ready to a much larger audience.
I'll have to make sure that I have a better than COVID haircut then in preparation.
Yes, most definitely. The you are a family man. You already told me that when you went to King's, your kids were small. Just a little bit about your family and how you spend your spare time beyond neurology and movement disorders.
Well, I can do this quickly. Unfortunately, I've got another call coming up, but yes, I value the family side tremendously, but in my developing early career, one of the reasons I succeeded was that I had a very, very supportive wife who managed at home with the kids for the most part. And so we had two young boys when we went to England. When we returned to Canada, we had a third child, our daughter. So we have three children now, grown adults with families of their own. Two of my children live in the Toronto area, my daughter and my second son. And I have my eldest son is in the United States, works in San Francisco. He has two boys, two children. My middle son has two children, a boy and a girl, and my daughter has a daughter. So we have five grandchildren. And that's absolutely a wonderful new experience in our lives to be involved in the development and growth and wonderful interactions with our grandchildren. So it's fantastic.
Tony, thank you very much. Your story is a good example of humanity, which is badly needed in this world. And as I said, this pandemic is reminding us important of that. And the scientific community is united as ever. If some political leaders wanted us to be divided, we have proven it is not on, and we have built barriers. If we can't meet face to face, we are meeting virtually. If we can't share information face to face, we are meeting virtually. I have been running this World Brain Day campaign for some time, and I've never visited countries like I have done this time. Over many sleepless nights, but I will be sharing a lot more stories with the rest. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed the discussion. I really appreciate your dedication to this program. As you say, many sleepless nights to be able to talk to people from all over the world. And I hope your audience appreciates your commitment to this. And I hope everybody is safe and healthy. And we look forward to the World Brain Day.
Absolutely. And all the best. Stay safe, stay well. Thank you very much.